Hey, what's going on, everybody? Special guest here, Jordan Hill, covers Georgia for Dogs247 in the 24/7 Sports Network. We're here to talk about Carson Beck. There's a lot of excitement in Coral Gables with the addition of the quarterback. So let's get into Carson here. Let's start with 2024. Just what'd you make of his season? And we're going to break this all down. We're going to look at some analytics, his strengths, his weaknesses as a player, maybe what to expect at Miami, and obviously big expectations. Can Carson lead Miami to an ACC title? But what'd you make of his 2024 season, Jordan?
Well, Christopher, I'd say on the whole it was disappointing, though I wouldn't put it all on Carson. It was a season full of ups and downs. He had a stretch in the middle of that season where I felt like he was kind of forcing throws. He had, I think, back-to-back three interception games, Texas and Florida, and Georgia finds a way to win those games. But I thought after that Florida game, he kind of took a step back and said, "Look, I'm pressing a little too much. I'm trying to do too much. So let's just kind of settle down." And the shame of him getting hurt in the SEC title game, I did think his last probably three or four games he was playing really well. And when I talk about him pressing, I think that there's some to blame on some of the other guys on the Georgia offense. This Georgia receiving core had the most drops in the country. I think they ended with 36. The run game really, really struggled. Just never could find consistency. Wound up second to last in the SEC in rushing yards per game. Offensive line was not as strong as people expected. So I think that kind of explains some of why Carson pressed some. But at the same time, I thought that even in those struggles, there was never really a question about, hey, they may turn this thing to Gunnar Stockton. They knew Carson Beck was their best chance and their best player, and put them in the best position to win games. And he did a great job of that. They win the SEC title after losing him, but he deserves a lot of credit for what he did in his 2 years as a starter. I thought again he bounced back from a pretty rough stretch in the middle of 2024. And I think there's plenty of reason for Miami fans to be excited.
Jordan, one of the things, looking from afar with Carson and the Georgia program and kind of relating to Miami, the early days that I was started covering the team when Miami was competing for national titles. And I always felt like seeing that situation play out and Miami falling short there, it's just much different when teams are the expectations of competing for a national title. And certainly Miami had a good year this year, surprised some people. They certainly rose in the rankings and had a good year, and maybe they could have gotten into the playoffs but they weren't going into the season thinking national title. What do you make of Carson handling expectations, everything at Georgia coming off the national titles since he's been a starter there, and just everything that comes along with that, kind of competing at a high level week in and week out, just the expectations and going through that there?
I think he handled it really well, and he took a lot of criticism even when Georgia was winning. Fans always kind of took issue with his sideline demeanor. He's not a guy that's rah rah in your face. There was a lot made of one point. I think that was the end of the Ole Miss game. Him and Jaden Rashada on the sideline smiling, talking about we don't know what. We didn't have the context to it, and fans were upset about it. But if you talk to any of his teammates, I mean, they said that he leads the right way. That they look at him. He's true to who he is, and Carson's talked about that. I think that was in the lead up to the SEC title game, where he said, I'm gonna lead the way that I want to lead. If I act a different way, then that's not genuine to who I am. I think that he's a guy that really has high expectations. He's a guy that talked about after the loss to Alabama in the SEC title game in 2023, that basically he made up his mind walking off the field that day that I'm coming back. There was a chance he could have gone pro. He wanted to come back and win a national title, and that wound up not happening. But I think he's a guy that's driven to win. I think you're going to see that from how he settles in at Miami. I think he comes in wanting to take Miami to a national championship. And I think that the fact he didn't do that at Georgia, I'm sure that is going to be a motivating factor. There was a point after the 2021 season, he was a backup. He didn't really play that much. That he told one of his roommates, this is nice. We won a national title, but this isn't my national title. I had nothing to do with this team, as far as on the field winning it. I think that drives him, and I think you're going to hear that a lot once he gets settled in at Miami. That he's coming in. He wants to play really well, but probably more than anything, he wants the Hurricanes to win it all.
You touched on the interception games, which I definitely want to get into. Let's stay with his strengths. When it's going well for Carson Beck, what does it look like to you? When he's had his positive moments, his big games. As you mentioned, you were pleased with what you saw, kind of as he turned it down the stretch there. What's it look like? What can Miami fans essentially expect and maybe look for when it's going well for Carson?
This may seem like a low bar to hit, but a lot of quarterbacks don't do this. He just, for the most part, when he's playing well, he's not forcing the football. He's willing to throw the ball away. He's willing to take a sack if he has to. And, I think that that's when he was struggling, that was what was so drastically different about what we had seen is that in the past he had not tried to force throws. He did a great job his first year of starting in 2023 of not throwing very many interceptions. I mean, he just is very smart with the football. When he gets in a rhythm, he does a very good job of controlling the pocket, understanding just how much time he has. I thought at times this year you saw him use his legs, and he's not the most mobile guy, but he can move, and he's made cuts to get to rushing touchdowns that I think probably surprised the defender who's looking up watching 15 go into the end zone. Very consistent with those intermediate throws. He's a guy that you can trust to make those throws, to be on the same page with his receivers. He's a guy that, came into this season considered one of the top quarterbacks in the SEC, and I think rightfully so. The thing I will be interested to watch at Miami is if he can continue growing with the deep ball. I thought that was his biggest area of weakness in 23. I thought you saw strides with it this year. And then some of the missed opportunities were more on the receivers. I think about a drop that Arian Smith had on the opening drive against Alabama that, I mean, Carson could not have put that ball in a better spot, So for me, if anyone has reservations about Carson because of this year, I don't know that that's entirely fair. I mean, there were games, like I said, where he was pressing a little bit, but Georgia's receivers were just very underwhelming, and they certainly did not make the situation easier for their quarterback.
Let's stay with that deep ball stuff. Just watching him differently now compared to before, but just watch him. It felt like he was always, giving receivers opportunities to go downfield, deep balls. I'm looking at his PFF numbers, and he averaged 5.6 pass attempts of 28 yards or more, which is very comparable to Cam Ward. And that's what we're going to do just naturally. Essentially Carson compared to Cam. What we just saw Cam play at a really high level, elite level, passing the ball, but very similar there. The difference would be Cam completed his at 45% rate and Carson was at 37%. So as you mentioned, maybe kind of hitting on a few more there, but it seems like he's got the arm, it certainly does. He's willing to do it. I like to see that. I like these one-on-one situations, giving receivers opportunities to throw it. Can you expand a little bit more on Carson, the deep ball, and as you mentioned, a little bit of strides and maybe where you can see him kind of get to, or it definitely seems like it's a part of his game that he's willing to do and willing to try.
Yeah, 100%. And Mike Bobo, Georgia's offensive coordinator, talked about getting him to be more accurate and more consistent with that deep ball. This was back in fall camp, and Mike made it clear that Carson's got the arm for it. It's just more of sort of understanding what his receiver is going to do on it, and being able to be on that same page with what you expect from the receiver. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's going to be really interesting once he gets settled in with the Hurricanes, just getting on that same page, understanding your receivers, understanding what they're going to do on those deep balls. Because sort of like you said, Christopher, it's not for a lack of arm talent. I think it's more of just being on the same page with those guys when you go deep. Like you said, he's not a guy that will hesitate to hit that shot and try that shot. I think about that SEC title game against Alabama. I think that was in the third quarter. He hit Arian Smith with a great pass for a big gain that kind of gave Georgia some momentum when they had been trailing. So, yeah, he's a guy that he's not afraid to throw deep. He trusts his arm. The biggest thing I think is just going to be kind of building that rapport with those Miami receivers, being on the same page. I think if he does that in the lead up to the season, that he will have an opportunity to take another step forward when it comes to throwing deep.
Jordan, you touched on Mike Bobo and his offensive system. If you could expand on him a little bit more, that pro spread and kind of the difference from Miami, which we'll see. We'll kind of see how Carson kind of adjusts to it, but Miami kind of in this spread, air raid offense, kind of the differences again, kind of just comparing percentages from what Carson did at Georgia compared to what Cam did at Miami. So it's going to be like less play action, less screens than what Carson did at Georgia. And the play action stuff, Carson looked to be very good at that, PFF numbers. Can you explain maybe Mike Bobo's offense and how Carson fit in? What Bobo wanted from his quarterback, what he wanted from Carson, what he expected, what they looked to do. I know you touched on the receivers and the running backs, which we'll touch on a little bit, but can you talk about the offense a little bit about with Coach Bobo there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would look back to 2024 and compare it to 2023. When you look at 2024, they asked Carson Beck to throw significantly more, and I think that was a product of having lost their two leading running backs from the previous season. Both guys went pro. You bring in Trevor Etienne, but you had several freshmen that were backing up Trevor, and Trevor missed time early in the year. So it was a situation where they kind of turned it to Carson and said, all right, we're going to go essentially as far as you can take us with this offense. But with Mike's offense, a lot of pre-snap motion, play action, like you talked about, and I think that lack of a run game and the inconsistency of the run game, it sort of added to the pressure on Carson this year. That they felt like they had to throw the ball if they were going to extend drives, if they were going to keep defenses on their heels, and I think as the season went on, defensive coordinators, defenses understood that they understood that the game was going to be won or lost on number 15. I think Carson did a good job of trying to make the most of, like you said, a lot of screens in this offense, sometimes out of necessity because, I think about the Ole Miss game where it was in the rain and you're talking about a receiving core that was already struggling with drops. Throw in the element of rain, it was just ugly. And they kind of had to lean on the screens in that offense. So I'll be fascinated when I watch Miami this upcoming season just to see how much more effective Miami's run game can be, because I think that just makes things so much easier for Carson. So much was just put on him because they could not consistently run the football, and I think that kind of really forced Mike Bobo's hand with what he was able to call, and again, kind of put more pressure than I think needed to be on Carson because they knew that throwing the ball was their best chance.
Let's go back to the interceptions. We only touched on it a little bit early, but what stands out to me is they came in bunches. You had 3 games of 3 interceptions, finished with 12 there and kind of breaking those down. 9 of the 12 came over the middle, which look, a lot of quarterbacks, you throw over the middle. So that's not necessarily the issue, but I'm sure that's something he wants to clean up a little bit. Interceptions, if you could kind of put them in totality, maybe it is the receivers, things like that. But what did he get himself in trouble with on some of the interceptions? Because again, obviously you don't want them to come in bunches. Although Georgia was able to, as you mentioned, kind of withstand some of that and then still get wins in most of those games there.
I think you hit on the biggest thing, Christopher, in that it's like if one happened, then you could count on there being about three in the game. I think that he kind of got in his head a little too much. The 2 games I would say, if Miami fans want to go back and see where interceptions I thought were really an issue for Carson, was back-to-back games, Texas, and then Georgia had a bye week, and then they played Florida and Jacksonville, back-to-back 3 interception games where it was just when you watch those plays, it's just Carson trusting his arm too much. I mean, just guys being covered. I think the second interception against Florida, where, I mean, there's at least 2 guys in the vicinity who could intercept the pass, maybe 3. I think that there were just situations where he kind of got in his own head in some of those moments, trying to make something happen again with an offense that, if you look through the numbers, especially in the first half, really struggled. I mean, there were I think 6 times in Georgia's 2024 season that they went into halftime down. I think a lot of those times, a lot of those plays we're talking about were, they were situations where Carson kind of trusted his arm to make something happen, even if what he was looking at, was not setting up for success for Georgia. Those 2 games, Texas and Florida, I would point to those where early mistake and then you let it snowball. And to his credit, he bounced back and played well down the stretch, but really struggled at times taking care of the football.
Obviously, with Miami and its approach and what they would like to do, they definitely want to run the ball, as you've touched on quite a bit with Georgia there. Miami last year, sixth in the conference in rushing yards per conference game. They actually lead the conference in total rushing, which is a little bit of surprise there. They had that strong game at the end. So Miami wants to run the ball, but receivers, that's a huge part for a quarterback. What do you what is essentially what does Miami need at receiver for Carson to do well? What kind of receivers, even tight ends, as you mentioned, the screen game, maybe it is backs that catch the ball. Essentially, what's ideal for Carson? What has worked well over his career at Georgia in terms of weapons? And Miami, look, Miami's got to replace its top four receivers. They've got some guys that they're certainly counting on and think that they can do well. But if you could kind of pinpoint what works best for Carson, how would you describe it?
I'd honestly say, Christopher, quantity more than, quality. Obviously, you want to have some of the best receivers, but you look through this season, I think specifically early in the year, Carson is really effective when it comes to getting different guys involved. I mean, I can think of games where it's like, yeah, it's halftime and he's hit six different receivers. So I think if you give him different options, he's not going to rely just on one guy and say, okay, you're an all ACC caliber receiver. You're getting the ball, eight, nine times a game. No, he does a very good job of spreading the ball around. I would say, to get a good pass catching tight end always helps. I thought that when Georgia started getting the tight ends more involved in the passing game was about the time that it kind of felt like Carson turned a corner in 2024. That they were looking for a while to have not necessarily the next Brock Bowers, but to find the guy that was going to be that pass catcher. And they kind of did it by committee with Oscar Delp, Lawson Lucky, Ben Urosic that they got from Stanford. So that's what I would say is, you don't necessarily have to have a first round caliber receiver for him to be productive. It's getting a few different guys that can be involved. Didn't hit the running backs out of the backfield a ton, though they did with some effectiveness with Trevor Etienne. But I would say getting three or four really quality receivers. If you can get a tight end, it's going to make life a lot easier for him. But he's willing and he's willing and able to spread the ball around. I think you'll see that at Miami.
And I didn't mention tight end, but Miami obviously has to replace its top tight end as well, in addition to the wide receivers. But they want to get the ball to the tight ends. They did that well last year after finishing last in the conference the year before. So we'll see how that kind of plays out too. Just with Carson and the things that you mentioned earlier in terms of his leadership and those kinds of skills, as we touch on all of these things that make up a quarterback and where he throws it, intermediate screen play, all these kinds of deep ball, all of it, interceptions, touch, the whole thing. But the intangibles, such an important part of leadership and, just kind of leading the team. Because as I mentioned before, can Carson lead Miami to an ACC title? And I know you touched on national title, and I do feel like that's going to be the talk around Miami. I just feel like this is just my own personal opinion with the Miami program in general. All the years of covering them, I think they've gotten themselves in a little bit of trouble of looking too far ahead. So I think if they just focus on winning their school's first conference title game, I think that would be great, a great accomplishment. And then everything else, obviously, you get the playoff berth if you do that. And Miami has not, they didn't get to the championship game last year. So I think that's a big one there. But leadership, as you mentioned, he's got his own style and he feels like he's going to do it his way. What do you expect from them? And this is going to be interesting. Stepping right into the program, to the team, expecting to lead, be the leader. He has all the experience coming from Georgia, the whole thing. How would you kind of describe it, and how do you think it's going to go at Miami in terms of a leadership thing?
I think he's a lead by example guy. I don't think you're going to see a lot of clips of him giving some kind of pregame rah-rah speech, but I think he's a guy that is very confident in his ability, and I think you heard that over and over, not only from his teammates but Kirby Smart. There was never in my mind any doubt in Carson's ability, and Kirby and the staff, they stuck by him during those games that we're talking about because they understood what he was capable of. And I think that Carson's going to come in with a renewed sense of wanting to prove himself. And I think he's a guy that still has total confidence in his ability. I think that there's got to be some motivation going back to Florida. He's from Jacksonville. He's a guy that won a state championship at Mandarin High School as a junior. I think that he sees that there are people who doubt him, and I'm sure that there are a lot of Georgia fans who are frustrated by how this whole thing played out, and some fans that are really downplaying what he meant to the team. I think he's a guy that people look to, and people trusted in big moments that, hey, Carson Beck's going to put us in position to win this game, and he did that more often than not. But I do think that there's going to be a piece of Carson that wants to go down there and prove that he is an NFL caliber quarterback, and I still think he is. Now, obviously, he faces some big tests these next few months, rehabbing that from that elbow injury, getting back to where he was. But I think you're going to see a guy that sees this as a real opportunity and that wants to come in, wants to be a leader for this Miami team. And I think fascinated once you guys get to talk to him, just to see his mentality, his approach, because I do think that he's a guy that understands what it's going to take if Miami's going to be, nationally relevant in 2025, be a contender in 2025. He knows coming from Georgia that getting to that point is a daily process, and I think you're going to hear that he understands that he can't look ahead, sort of like you were saying. He's going to take it day by day, and I think he's going to put Miami in a position to be successful.
One of the things I keep thinking about all the comparisons with Cam, as I touched on a few of it here. I know that will be, part of the discussion. He's stepping right in after the big individual season by Cam, but Cam didn't complete everything that Miami set out to do. And I think Carson can look at that. As great as Cam was, like I mentioned, they didn't get to the ACC title game. They didn't win a bowl game. They didn't get to the college football playoff. There are things that can still be accomplished as opposed to filling in for a quarterback that did everything. So I think that is a little bit more interesting. Yes, big shoes to fill with what Cam was able to do, and we'll see how everything transpires. Jordan, I do want to wrap this up, but you mentioned the elbow injury. We went through this whole thing without really even talking about it. But how much time do you think it's going to take based on what you knew of the injury when it happened, and kind of what to expect based on what you were hearing at the time, and then essentially, the recovery and the expectations, all of this that we're talking about with what he could do is obviously under the assumption he's going to be back at full strength. But I guess any insight they could provide with his elbow injury, for those that don't know, injured the first half there in that SEC championship game. What can you say about him there?
Yeah, the last I had heard, probably the end of December when he had the surgery and he began, sort of the process after the surgery. I kind of looked to spring practice as the opportunity that maybe he would start throwing. Don't anticipate he would be able to participate during spring practice, but start throwing, work his way up, and get ready to really start participating in the summer when you have those off-season workouts, when teams have an opportunity. The coaches can organize it, but the players get together and kind of work in the lead up to fall camp. So that's really, I see spring practice for Miami as the point where you kind of check in and see how he's doing, what he's able to do. Because this was a surgery where, the whole reason he didn't play in that second half, they kind of worked with him to see what he was able to do. He couldn't grip the football. And, after that, it's like, okay, it's pretty significant, and then undergoes the surgery. So, yeah, it's going to be a ramping up process, I expect, that, it'll be probably June or July before he's finally feeling like the quarterback he was before, which makes this whole thing interesting because, he's probably going to be going through fall camp and having ups and downs, which I think is only natural given this surgery, the significance of it, and given all the new pieces that he's going to be playing with. So, spring practice, I don't anticipate he'll be able to do much, but the summer months will be big as he works to get back and gets ready for fall camp with the Hurricanes.
And that's what's going to make, like as you mentioned, it's going to be very interesting. Miami's going to open against Notre Dame, so we'll see how how it all goes. And I will be very curious if he's not able to, as you mentioned, do everything full go in the spring. what he's able to gain from his receivers. It's going to be a new receiving core. This is what's so interesting with Miami too. Everything is going to be new in terms of roles for these guys, and they're essentially going to be doing it without the guy that they're going to have during the season. So it's going to be kind of just this interesting dynamic with Miami and spring ball. Jordan, great stuff. This is excellent insight. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it. Time's valuable. I'll let you get back to it, but this was great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.